It's finally January, which means it's time to wrap up all the books that I read in December, and I have to say that December was one of the weirdest reading months I've had in a good long while, possibly ever. I DNF'd more in December than I typically do in a full year, and it really almost put me back in a reading slump. This year has kind of been characterized by my being in these kind of reading slump moments where I'm having trouble with finding the motivation to pick something up, and I had kind of gained momentum going into December, and then I just kept having to DNF books, which in some ways was kind of freeing, because it meant that I wasn't wasting time on books that I wasn't enjoying, but also because I kept picking things up that I was excited for and then DNFing them partway through, I started to lose some of that momentum and motivation, and I kind of clawed my way out of a slump at the very last second. So before we talk about the books I actually finished in December, I think we need to talk a little bit about the DNFs. The first three I'm not going to talk about in as much depth because these were This Golden Flame by Emily Victoria, The Salt Line by Holly Goddard Jones, and A Shadow All of Light by Fred Chappell. I DNF'd all of those while working on my self-destructing books list, so I kind of went in with that expectation that that might happen, that I might start reading them and realize that these just aren't for me, that they don't really match my reading taste now because they've been on my shelf for a very long time. They were things that I bought years ago when I was like an undergrad, and now it's like almost 10 years later for some of those. So like I kind of went into those with the expectation that I might DNF them, and that's okay. And I don't think DNFing is a bad thing. I think in a lot of ways it's a positive. So I kind of went in with that expectation, and it was really the later DNFs that caused me more of a problem with my motivation, because the next two I DNF'd were both arcs for books that one came out earlier this year and one is coming out in January, and it just really threw me for a loop because they were ones that I was pretty excited for. So the first arc I DNF'd was Lightfall by Ed Crocker. This one is a fantasy murder mystery set in a world where there are no humans, but there are vampires, werewolves, and sorcerers. I'm not entirely clear on how sorcerers are different from humans, but anyway, they are apparently. So it's set in this fantasy world with these different immortal races, and in the midst of all of this, the son of a vampire aristocrat dies. He's murdered, and it sets off a chain of events that leads to the unraveling of a conspiracy amongst the vampire nobility. And it sounded like it was going to be pretty fun. I love a good murder mystery. I love some intrigue. I ended up having a lot of problems with this book in terms of its writing, its world building, and its characters, with I think the kind of two biggest being that writing and characters. I really struggled to get into this one because the writing I think was aiming for lush and descriptive, but it was really just coming off as like kind of clunky and awkward, and there was a lot of like really strange dialogue where I was like, I don't think, like, even if you're aiming for kind of fantasy, I couldn't even tell you what time period it's aiming for, but it's like, and maybe that's part of the problem, but some of the dialogue, I was like, even if you're aiming for fantasy, this dialogue is really stilted, like nobody's really interrupting each other, and I kept doing this thing where characters would have like an ellipsis in the middle of their sentence right before the last word, so it would just randomly emphasize the last word of what they were saying, and a lot of times it didn't really need to be emphasized. So like there was one character who kept saying like, if my theory is ... correct. And he kept saying it, like, every time he would talk about his theory, if my theory is correct. And it just kept doing that, and it was every character would talk like that. It wasn't like a specific quirk that one character had, it was everybody who was doing that, which I found really weird and awkward to read. And there were some other just like weird turns of phrase here and there. But on top of the weird dialogue and the weird writing, the characters were also pretty insufferable. I think that my main issue was that the characters felt like they were aiming for kind of like badass and cool, but they came across as smug and really honestly not very smart, because I think especially one of them was supposed to be like very book smart, but she was extremely condescending to another character who's supposed to be like her best friend, and the best friend is like really street smart. She's got like lots of contacts. She's kind of involved in the gossip networks around this castle, and so she's somebody who has a lot of knowledge, and the main character, or the POV character we're following for those sections, is all like, I'm so smart because I read all these books, and like, poor Beth, all she knows is gossip, and it's just really dumb, especially because she's in a castle, she's in like an aristocrat's castle. It would be really important for her to know what's going on, and to know the gossip, and kind of understand the different threads of power in this place, but she just doesn't care, and I'm like, that could be interesting, but it wasn't written in a way where I think that was supposed to be a part of her character. She was just really smug. And then the other character that I met at that point, the other kind of main POV character, was basically BBC Sherlock with the serial number filed off. He was just that, but worse somehow. And that's coming from somebody who loved BBC Sherlock for a long time. But he's just kind of a smug jerk, and he does all of this monologuing. He first shows up in a scene where he is being actively attacked by an assassin, and for some reason the assassin is just kind of letting him monologue at him, and it came across like I was supposed to find these characters very cool and effortlessly badass, but it just came off as insufferable. And there was a third POV that we were following at the point that I had stopped, but I really liked that POV, and it's the father of the murder victim whose death kind of kicks off all of these events. He's the only person I felt like had a really meaningful and believable reason to be investigating his son's murder, but it was pretty clear he was being set up to be a villain, and I think that could be really interesting, especially since he's a POV character, but I just felt like he kept getting sidelined in favor of these other two characters that were far less interesting and a lot more unpleasant to read about, and not in an intentional way. So that was the first arc I DNF'd, and then the second one I DNF'd was more just that it was boring. I don't think it was paced or structured very well. This was... I've already forgotten the title. Hang on a second, my computer just went off. Let me find out. Lady Killer by Catherine Wood. This was another one. Again, I was very bummed DNFing this one because I was really interested in this. We're supposed to be following these two women, Abby and Gia. It took me a moment to come up with their names. So Abby is a lawyer and Gia is a socialite. They grew up together because Abby's mother was the chef, the personal chef for Gia's family. And they became fast friends as children, and they've been close friends for many, many years. They're both kind of late 20s, early 30s now. And there's a traumatic event that happened when they were 18 that drew them even closer together. And now, several years later, Gia has just married a man she just met, and they've had kind of a falling out as a result of that. But Abby is now going to meet her in Sweden for her birthday. So, or is it Switzerland? I don't remember. She's going to one of the Nordic countries to meet Gia for Gia's birthday. And Gia's brother, Benny, whom Abby has a crush on, is also supposed to be there. So the premise of the book is that Abby and Benny arrive in Sweden or Switzerland, I can't remember which one, and discover that Gia is not there, that she never shows up, and so they go to her home where she's living in Greece, and she's missing, and the only thing left behind is this manuscript that she's written that details her movements across about a month before she went missing. I really was intrigued by that premise. I like a manuscript in a book. I always think that's kind of interesting, and I liked that it was set up that Gia has written a memoir before, and that was kind of her way of processing some of the events that were happening to her. But it was paced very strangely because we have Abby's timeline, which is supposed to be the present timeline where we find out that Gia's missing and everything. And Abby's timeline was actually really focused on talking about the past. It was Abby kind of reminiscing on how she ended up a part of Gia's life, how they became friends, and then talking a little bit, but not kind of in detail, because clearly there's supposed to be more details that you find out later about this traumatic event that happened several years ago, in which we know right from the start that Gia killed somebody to protect Abby, that Abby was being assaulted by one of Gia's stalkers, and Gia murdered that man to protect Abby. And this event has kind of cemented their friendship in a really dramatic way. So we get a little bit about that, and we get some reminiscing on her friendship with Benny. And it's just every time Abby is on page, we're getting these kind of backward looking moments of her reminiscing on things. And so I read the first quarter of the book, and in all that time, by the time I actually stopped, Abby and Benny had just arrived at the hotel where they were supposed to be meeting Gia, and all of Abby's on-page time was spent basically thinking about the past. On top of that, Abby's sections are incredibly short, and they're pretty rare throughout the first part of the book, and most of the book is actually Gia's manuscript, so we're reading about Gia's movements for the month before she went missing, and that's where actually all of the action is in this manuscript, where you know something has happened to Gia, but you don't know exactly what has happened, and it's all of this kind of movement towards the present day. But the thing that was really frustrating there is that a lot of the manuscript is taken up by really strange and ominous things happening, and Gia is totally missing it. Gia does not pick up on any of the weirdness at all. And then the rest of her manuscript is really focused on how much she likes sleeping with her husband, how she's super attracted to everybody in her house, including the new friends that they've just brought in, who are obviously quite sinister and suspicious. It's just about like her attraction to everyone and the like sexual politics within her household, which I think could be interesting, but I don't think was handled very well in this one because so much of it is just focused on Gia talking about having sex with her husband. And I was just like, I don't care anymore. I want some, I want the sinister stuff to ramp up. I want more suspense and more thrills in this thriller that I'm reading. And it just was this weird pacing, and it didn't really work because nothing thrilling had happened. So after I read about 15%, I decided to go look at some Goodreads reviews just to see if it was just me that was feeling this way. And I noticed that a lot of the reviews were mentioning that, and a couple of people said that it actually doesn't ramp up until the 50% mark, which in my opinion is far too late for the action to kick off in a thriller. So I ended up just putting this one down because I was super bored, and it was creating, as my friend likes to say, a log jam where I couldn't bring myself to pick something else up because I was like, I gotta finish this arc, I gotta review it. So I ended up DNFing this one as well. So yeah, those are the two that I DNF'd, and clearly I have, 2 of 5. Clearly I have some strong feelings about that. I really hate DNFing arcs, I really hate DNFing debuts because I like to give them a little more slack. It's the author's first traditionally published work. It's going to be a little rough around the edges. That's just the reality of it. There are a few debuts that have completely, blown me away, but typically there's going to be some weirdness that you have to just kind of roll with. But I think in this case, for both of them, it was all weirdness and not enough substance. So yeah, that was really frustrating, and because of that, I ended up, completely scrapping a good chunk of my TBR for the month and shifting around the books that I was reading, putting new things in for Reindeer Readathon, because I was, looking at the stack and going, I keep picking things from the stack and having a terrible time, so I'm gonna stop. And we kind of shifted things around. The month went on. It was okay. That said, even after all those DNFs, I did manage to finish 4 books this month, and I had a good time with all of them. I think they're all 4 or 4.5 stars. So it was overall, a good reading month quality-wise in terms of the stuff that I actually finished. It was just a really weird one. But the first book that I did finish was Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. I think I gave this one 4 stars. I had a lot of fun with this one. This is a murder mystery with a podcast element, and I love both of those things. I love a murder mystery. I love a podcast. And this was even better because I listened to this one via audio, and I normally don't do well with audiobooks, but this one, the narrator is absolutely fantastic. I can't remember the 2 names. I think January Lavoie is one of them, and I can't come up with the male narrator's name, but I'll try to remember to put them on the screen here so that you can see and acknowledge the people who did the wonderful work on this. But this is a podcast book where the entire podcast is in the book, and they did some really great production in the audiobook so that you actually are listening to the podcast as the book goes along. It was so fun. We're following a woman who, I can't actually remember her name at the moment, but we're following this woman who, when she was younger, about 10 years ago or 5 years ago, her best friend was murdered, and she is the prime suspect, but there was never enough evidence for her to be charged with anything, and she actually doesn't remember what happened that night. She had sustained a head injury and was dealing with some amnesia, and so she can't remember what happened that night. And she can't defend herself and say that she didn't kill her best friend, but she also isn't convinced that that's necessarily what happened because they were so close, and she's like, I can't imagine a circumstance in which I would have killed my best friend. But because of the way that it's impacted her, she's kind of morbid, she's very sarcastic, and she has this kind of ongoing issue of imagining killing people because of the trauma associated with having become basically a social pariah as a result of this accusation against her. And the book is following her as she returns to town because a podcaster goes to her hometown and is making a podcast about this unsolved case, and it basically ruins her life. It gets her fired, and she's just like, well, I guess I'll go home because her grandmother's having a birthday party, and she's like, I guess I'll go home and deal with whatever this is. And so the podcaster's doing that, and so he's one of our POV characters, and I really enjoyed him because we get his POV through the podcast, and then we get our main character as she is meeting people, dealing with the prejudice of her small town. It's a small town in Texas, and the two of them kind of working together as the book goes on to try and figure out what happened, to see if they can peel back the layers of everything that happened and come to an actual conclusion. I really enjoyed this. It was just a ton of fun. I really liked the way that it dealt with how being accused had impacted her, how the loss of her best friend had impacted her, and there were a lot of moments where I was really enjoying the bantery relationship between her and the podcaster. There's a touch of a romance there. I'm not going to say more than that, but it was an interesting relationship that they developed, and I really enjoyed seeing her relationships with all the other characters in the town, especially her grandmother. Her grandmother's really funny and just a really fun character to follow, and so I was just having a great time with this. I think my main issue is that when we get the reveal at the end of the book about who actually did the murder, it's a little bit underwhelming because it's not foreshadowed very well. There's basically no evidence up until the last few chapters that the person who did the murder. So you don't really have a chance to kind of guess that that's who's behind everything until you get to the very end of the book and it's being revealed. I just wanted a little bit more showing me that this character was a viable suspect before that character is revealed as the killer. So that was my main issue with the book, but overall I just had a really fun time listening to this, and I listened to it for a work book club, so we ended up having a really fun discussion about this one as well, so it was a great time. After that, I finished the last of the 4 books I was reading for my self-destructing books list vlog that I was working on, which is Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter, so I will direct you to that video again if you want to see more of my thoughts on this. But overall, I thought this was really good. It's a really dark book. It's really difficult to read. It is dealing with some very difficult topics, but I really liked the way that this explored the relationship between the 2 main characters. We're following Claire and Lydia, who are sisters who have been estranged for almost 20 years because of an event that involved Claire's husband, and they're brought back together once Claire's husband is murdered, and a series of kind of disturbing realities about him are revealed. The 2 of them are kind of digging through all this information about him and trying to figure out what's actually going on, because clearly there are some people that want something from Claire, thinking that she has information that she doesn't have, so they're trying to figure out what was her husband involved in and how do they get themselves out of this situation. A lot of this book is really focused on the relationship between Claire and Lydia and how the loss of their sister when they were very young, because they also had a sister who went missing and was never found. The loss of their sister has also had this profound impact on their relationship. So it's really looking at that dynamic, at the ways that that loss brought them together, but also the ways that the later incident with Claire's husband kind of pushed them apart, and the ways that their lives have gone very differently from each other, as they're also trying to deal with this horrific situation that they find themselves in now. And again, this one's very, very dark. I would say be very careful if you go into this. This has a lot of dark topics. There's a scene near the end that I have literally just written in my reading journal. I could have gone my whole life without reading that. So be careful reading this one, but I think that this was a really excellent look at the family dynamics in this particular relationship, and in some of the larger family dynamics as well, because there's this expanded look at not only how it affected the 2 sisters, but also how it affected their father and mother and the overall unity of their family. So it was really interesting. I found it really engaging and pretty easy to read. I read this, despite it being quite thick, I read it pretty quickly, and I was pretty hooked through the whole thing. I kept picking it up because I just needed to know what happened. So I think this is really fun in a very dark way. And it feels bad to say this is a fun book, but I think that that's kind of true despite the dark content. After that, I read the one arc I did actually complete in December, which was The Twyford Code by Janice Hallett. And I have to say, I think this is my least favorite Janice Hallett, but she's one of my favorite mystery writers. So The Worst Janice Hallett is still a really damn good book. I had a great time with this. I think it just drags a little bit in the middle, but we're following this guy named Smithy, who is a convict who's recently been released from prison. He's kind of integrating back into society, and he wants to reconnect with his son. He finds out he has a son, and they're very estranged, obviously, because Smithy's been in prison for 10 years. But he tries to reconnect with his son, and his son is basically I don't want you in my life, but I still care about you, so here, have this cell phone so that we can kind of stay in contact, but I don't want you meeting my family or being a part of my children's lives, but I'll text you or whatever. So Smithy gets his phone, and he's reintegrating into society, kind of figuring things out, and he starts keeping an audio diary on the phone where he is investigating this thing that happened that he sees as kind of the source of all of his issues as a child, or not entirely the source, but it's this kind of moment that he identifies as a turning point for him, where he could have been okay if he continued on the path he was on, but when he was a young child, I think late middle school, early high school kind of age, he's 14 or 15 or something, about that age, he has an English teacher who suddenly goes missing, and he thinks that that's kind of the turning point for him, because her disappearance resulted in him never going back to school because he was kind of traumatized from that event, and he kind of goes off the rails from there. So now, all these years later, as an older adult, he's trying to put the pieces together, see if he can figure out what actually happened to this teacher and get some closure on that. And as a result of his efforts to uncover that, he's really peeling back the layers of his entire life and looking at his family situation and how that shaped him. He's looking at the things that came after the teacher's disappearance and his involvement in kind of organized crime and the ways that those experiences shaped him, and all of the different things that have kind of come together to make Smithy who he is. And he's also like trying to develop relationships outside of prison. He's reconnecting with some of his classmates from when he was in that class where the teacher disappeared. And a lot of it's much more like a character study for most of the book, because it's about Smithy and the things that made Smithy who he is at the time of the book happening. So I feel like the middle part of this drags a little bit, because you get a lot of really strong mystery elements around the disappearance of the teacher kind of early on, and then this middle section is much more involved in telling the story of what happened with his family and kind of finding out what happened with his brother and his father and the ways that those relationships changed him. And then there's also this other element of looking at his involvement in organized crime and his relationships with the family that he worked for, and the ways that those relationships changed over time, and that changed him. So it kind of drags a little bit in the middle, because so much of it is these overlapping stories that he's telling, which I think is a really interesting structure, but it definitely means that you're getting a little bit less of the kind of core mystery pieces throughout that bit. But then the ending really makes up for it. I think that the ending is fantastic. The reveals are great. That's one thing that I think Janice Hallett does fantastically well, is she comes up with these really bonkers reveals, but she completely sticks the landing on them because she commits to them. Like, they're wild, but she goes for it in a really sincere way, and I just really appreciate that about her writing. So I love the reveals at the end of this book, and the very last line of this I think is kind of genius. I love just the way that the whole thing wraps up, and the way that Smithy's story matters in the end. And I just really enjoyed reading this one. I did, again, have a little bit of trouble in the middle because of that slow section. But when we got to the end, I was, like, devouring, like, the last 20% because I just needed to know what happened. And it was just such a good time. So, like, again, the Worst Janice Hallett book is still a really good book. And I cannot more highly recommend any of her books. I think this one is just, like, the slowest one. Then the final book that I read in the month was after all of those DNFs. I read the Twyford Code, and then that was when I dove into those other two arcs that I ended up DNFing. So at that point, I really needed a win. I needed something that I knew I was going to like, because I was kind of like, am I slumping, or is it just the books? Is it a me problem, or is it a the books problem? And I decided to pick up something that I was like, if I don't like this, if I try to read this and I'm slumping and I can't get into it and I'm just not having a good time, then it's me. I'm the problem here. I'm in a slump and I need to deal with that. However, if I enjoy the book and I'm having a great time, the problem was the books that I DNF'd, and I was right to DNF them. The great news is it was not a me problem, it was the book's problem, because I picked up The Restaurant of Lost Recipes by Hisashi Kashawai, which is the second book in the Kamigawa Food Detective series, and I loved this. I had so much fun. I even liked this better than I liked the first book in this series. I think I gave the first book 4 stars, so I'm giving this one 4.5. This is a very formulaic series where each book is like 6 stories of people coming into the Kamigawa Food Detectives agency, which is also like a diner, and they're coming in and they want to find out about a specific food, or they want to re-experience a specific food that they had at a specific point in their past. And there's always like a different reason for why they want to have that food. For some people, it's because they need closure on something. For other people, it's because they want to be reminded of this specific moment in their lives. But every person comes with some sort of problem that they think will be solved by re-experiencing the specific food they associate with that memory. And our father-daughter duo here, Nagare and Koichi, work together to figure out what the food is. And Nagare is like a retired police detective, so he's like using his detective skills to do all of this, and it's just so fun. It's very formulaic, as I said, but I feel like in this installment I was really beginning to love the formulaic aspect of it. because the stories really aren't about the events that happen in them. They're about the people that come to the diner and the like connections and reflections that are made through the food. So a lot of this is about like food descriptions and about the emotions that people feel while they're eating. And I just really enjoy that. I like the way that it explores these characters like very grounded problems through food. And I also really appreciated in this one that this was a lot about kind of unresolved questions. We have these people who are coming in with, you know, should I do this or should I do that? Is this the right thing or is that the right thing? And the stories here basically say it kind of doesn't matter in this moment because it's not about whether the issue gets resolved, but it's about the way the person is reflecting on this and the way that they're feeling about everything. And it's not the Kamigawa Food Detectives' kind of goal to make them make a decision. It's just about getting them to reflect and be kind of honest with themselves. So I really enjoyed this aspect of kind of unresolved issues because each of those characters, there was like 3 or 4 in here that have that kind of aspect to them. And each of those characters walks away and you kind of don't know what they're walking away to. Like, are they going to make this decision or that decision? But that's kind of not the point. It's about the experience of it. And I just really enjoyed that. I had a lot of fun with it, and I liked this even better than the first book. I think the one thing that really held me back from loving this one as like a 5-star is that this author tends to get like little turns of phrase and things that he repeats. So it's not just like the formulaic nature of each story, but there's specific like ingredients that will crop up across multiple stories. I think like the first 3 or 4 in here all mention Worcestershire sauce, which I thought was weird. But there's like little ingredients or little turns of phrase that just get repeated across every story, which I found a little bit distracting because then I was just comparing across stories. There's also one where it mentions that like the diner looks like a residential building, and there's like 3 different stories where they're like, oh, it just looks like a residential building. So that was a little bit distracting. And then also there's like recurring characters in the first book who were absent for most of the first half. I think they don't show up until like the last 2 stories in this one. And I was just missing them. I was like, where are Tay and Hiroshi? I want them. I want them in the stories. There were some little minor gripes that I have that kept it from being a 5-star for me, but I still absolutely loved this. I had a great time, and this was a perfect book to end the year on. So this was the very last thing I read in December, and I could not be happier that I decided to pick this one up at that time. So those are all the books that I read in December. I'm pretty happy with the quality. Again, it was just a really weird month, but I would love to know down in the comments below what books you read in December, and especially what was your favorite thing you read in December? Like, what really stood out to you? Or alternatively, what was the last book you read in December and how did you feel about it? Like, what was the vibe that we were bringing at the very end of the year? That's what I would love to know, so let me know down in the comments below, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and hope to see you in the next video. Bye.